Then we get into Clay Guida versus Scott Holtzman. Combined age, if you consider the months in this one, is 80 between these two guys. Matt, when I think of Scott Holtzman, there's got to be a Canadian that's probably somewhere between 30 and 35 that has a poster of Scott Holtzman in his office or something. Because Holtzman played club hockey when he was at the University of Tennessee, which they have stats for it. I went to Hockey DB because I'm a big Hockey DB guy. And then I found Scott Holtzman, and he played a few games on a lower tier team. And so I click on it, and it's got all of his years and all of his stats. And then you click on the team, and there's only stats for Scott Holtzman. Why is that? I don't know. It's pretty weird. I don't put the one try I got in club rugby on my rugby rec. But when I think of Scott Holtzman, Matt, I think, man, this guy plays hockey, and he likes hot sauce. And again, I feel like some guy out there probably has a poster of him, with his big knockout wins. His big win over Dunhyun Ma. They're probably hot on that one.
I feel like you're a better hockey player than Scott Holtzman is really what the root of all this is. He beat my face in.
Some people ask me if it's live. What does that have to
do with any of it? That's a weird thing that you always bring up. I'll be like, hey, the sky's blue, and you're like, oh, Scott Holtzman would beat you up. I think this is a weird fight.
My main point to it, the fact that if you do look at his stats, he had 104 penalty minutes in 20 games. That's kind of wild. That's a fight every game.
Exactly, and then 2 other penalties sprinkled in there.
Couple trippings.
The thing about Scott Holtzman is, it is weird, and I brought this up earlier. You don't judge a fighter by how old they are. You judge them by how many difficult fights they've been in. And if you judge this fight based on those parameters, Clay Guida's about 98 years old, and Scott Holtzman's still in his, probably 50s, if we're being honest. He's still pretty old.
Clay Guida has 37 more pro fights.
But Scott Holtzman has been in a lot of firefights himself, and that's the thing that I do want to point to. A lot of Clay Guida's fights are, I'm wrestling, you're wrestling, it goes to a decision, hey, we'll see what happens. Clay Guida, although advanced in age, and although you might think of him for some of the crazier fights he has had, I don't really feel like he's a guy who, okay, if you look at him the wrong way, he's just gonna fall down. He does still have a certain level of durability in his career. I know he lost by submission to Claudio Puelles, but that's not a question mark surrounding his chin by any means. I just think for Guida, you probably think he is the much older guy in this matchup, and although not wrong, Scott Holtzman is not in his prime whatsoever. The way I look at this fight is a little bit how I look at Ryan Bader versus Fedor. I had a friend ask me about that fight.
The rematch?
The way I look at that is, the first time they fought, Ryan Bader was in his prime, and Fedor was definitely past his prime. But now, I think there's a pretty good argument that Fedor is very far removed from his prime, but Ryan Bader's not in his prime anymore, right? So maybe it evens the scale a little bit, just because Ryan Bader is that much older. That's kind of the way I look at this fight. 5 years ago, Scott Holtzman was much more in his prime than Clay Guida was. But I feel like at this point in their careers, Holtzman's not as explosive as he once was. Because we all know how good of a boxer he is on the feet. He has great power in his hands. The takedowns have always been an issue for him. But maybe 5 years ago, I think his strength would have really helped him with those takedown defenses. Because you can tell, don't just let me tell you or look at the graphic. He does use his physical strength a lot to defend some of those takedown attempts. And I think, again, a few years ago, he might have been able to do that. I just think now he might get caught up in some of the chain wrestling of Clay Guida.
There's things that I like out of this fight. There's things that I don't. And I mentioned some of those numbers for Darren Elkins and omitted them for Michael Johnson. But if I go back and I look at a guy like Clay Guida, 5th all-time in UFC fights. He's tied there with Damian Maia. He's 10th all-time in bonuses, tied there with 10 of them in general. And he's 8th with fight time, 6 hours, 14 minutes, and 36 seconds inside of the UFC's octagon. And if you look at it for Holtzman, he was 28 when he made his pro debut.
And Clay Guida was the Michael Johnson for Anthony Pettis coming to the UFC. That's how far back Clay Guida goes. Anthony Pettis
was supposed to get a title shot.
Has his own organization of fights, and Clay Guida's still in the UFC, okay? So it is wild to think how long Clay Guida's been around for.
But for Holtzman, I have it here, and I have it also on the graphics, so I'll switch those for yous. Shield Systems is where he's trained. So he does train there, but Jim O as well, so Brian Barberena. We talk about it, the GOAT, John Salter, at trying to solve the riddle of Clay Guida, as well as Joe Selecki. They all train out of that gym. Salter's kind of like that guy. But if you do look at it for him, he does really train his takedown defense to Scott Holtzman. If you look at it in the UFC, it evaded him in his losses. His loss to Drew Dober, his loss to Josh Emmett, his loss to Nick Lentz. And then if you look at it against Benil Dariush, his chin evaded him in that fight. And then against Gamrot, it was just the varied attack and then the chin in the end. But for Scott Holtzman, you kind of touched on it, but not too much. But his boxing really does get it done. When he's having success, it's really at a distance. He's got a lot of power at the end of that length, and he really can beat a lot of the guys in this division, or a lot of the guys that he has so far, with that length, with that range, with that size.
He definitely can. I think on the feet, this is definitely Scott Holtzman's fight to lose. I think he does have a big advantage in the striking because Clay Guida has been clipped before. Like, Jim Miller did it not that long ago.
Leonardo Santos was looking great against him until he got tired.
But Clay Guida, oh my goodness, cardio. Don't leave the house without it. The thing about Holtzman is, I don't think his cardio is going to fall off a cliff. I think he will struggle with some of the wrestling, but I still think on the feet, he is going to be a difference maker if he's able to land strikes, especially consistently, because we don't really know how good a 43-year-old Clay Guida is going to be able to react to some of those power shots of Scott Holtzman.
Matt, when we do have a look at this one, we'll bring up the odds. Let's see where they're at. Holtzman, slight favorite, open minus 205, minus 175 right now. Guida open plus 175, plus 143. We have a look at the Topology votes. Surprise to us, they are to you. I'm going to assume people are going with Holtzman because it's a favorite. I'm going to say over under 72.5% Holtzman.
I think it'll be over.
I think it's going to be over. It's under. 1,957 total votes, 59% Guida, 77% by decision for the 41% that have Holtzman, 72% by decision, and 16% by knockout. So, again, those going with Scott Holtzman, they like the Dunhyun Ma fight. They like the Jim Miller fight of the night where he lost the first round, but won round 2 and round 3.
That's what I'm about to bring up.
Is that what you like out of him?
It is, because that's the thing. Think about Jim Miller. I know him and Clay Guida had a crazy 30-second fight. It was absolutely... They both crack each other basically at the exact same time, and then Jim Miller cranks him with a guillotine. But Scott Holtzman beat Jim Miller by defending a lot of takedowns and beating him up on the feet. And the thing about Holtzman is, he doesn't have the cardio of a traditional power puncher. He isn't somebody who I would say gets exponentially stronger as the fight goes on, but he does keep a solid pace. The thing about Guida is, if he's not having success with his takedowns, I do think Holtzman, like I said earlier, is the much better fighter on the feet. Again, for Guida, he can crack, but if he wants to hurt Scott Holtzman, he's going to have to put everything into an overhand shot, and that's going to leave him very vulnerable if he's not able to land that shot. On the flip side, Holtzman could probably keep this fight at range, land his jab, land his straight right, kind of switch stances. He has good elbows on the inside too, and again, you bring it up. Is he going to struggle against those top-tier power punchers like a guy like Beneil Dariush? Of course he is. But guess what? Most guys in the UFC are going to struggle striking against a guy like Beneil Dariush. Oh my god, that spinning back fist was filthy though. But I do like Scott Holtzman ever so slightly in this fight. But like I said, 5 years ago, I would really like Holtzman in this one. Now, I do think he is removed from his prime as well, but I like the Jim Miller win.
I'm eager. I want to see both of them stand off toe-to-toe on Friday. Want to see them both at weigh-ins because Holtzman, although he has 2 inches of reach and less an inch 1 inch less in reach, 2 inches in height, we're doing it live. I do think Holtzman will be able to get the win here. I mean, Clay Guida, it's like, okay, you're taking on Claudio Poyas. Don't wrestle. What does he do? He wrestles him. You're taking on Jim Miller. Maybe you wrestle. Maybe you have success like Joe Selecki did, teammate of Scott Holtzman. What does he do? He brawls, and then he wrestles, and then he ends up getting finished. So for Guida, it just matters on what the game plan is going to be, because I would assume a team alpha male fighter like himself, he's going to go in there and wrestle against a guy like Scott Holtzman, who's shown that to be a problem. I mean, Holtzman against Josh Emmett. We never see Josh Emmett wrestle, and Emmett had tons of success in the wrestling in that fight. So I wouldn't be surprised if the underdog and Clay Guida got the win in this matchup. I'm going to go with Scott Holtzman. I think the hands are the difference maker, but I'm really looking forward to this fight between a couple of guys, again, combined age of 80.
You never know when it's going to be the last time when you watch Clay Guida fight. He's been in some memorable ones. Like, I always love watching Clay Guida fight, but I do like Scott Holtzman to get the win.
I hope it's not the last one.